Mighty. 7 stories about Abdu'l-Baha for children who want to serve the world. Written and narrated by Shirin Taherzadeh. This book is available on firstvalley.books.com. Dear children, over 100 years ago, there lived an extraordinary person whose name was Abdu'l-Baha. His remarkable life has inspired the hearts of millions of children and grown-ups around the world. Abdu'l-Baha was given the title, the Most Mighty Branch. Imagine a magnificent tree with many branches. It is the most mighty branch that withstands the winds and storms of time and offers the greatest shelter and protection. This is how Abdu'l-Baha was. Despite facing many hardships, he was a constant source of love, kindness, and refuge to all. He dedicated his life to promoting the Baha'i teachings of unity, justice, and peace. The stories in this book are based on real events. Some of the characters, however, have been imagined by the author. We hope that these stories will inspire you to live a life of service following the example of Abdu'l-Baha. Love, Shirin, Alyssa, Yas, Anjali, and Nisan. The Apple and the Bread. This story takes place in Ashgabat and then London in the year 1912. "Haji Amin!" shouted the young man. "Sir, please wait!" Haji Amin was walking through the busy marketplace and didn't hear his name being called out. The sounds of busy merchants haggling with crowds of customers could be heard on every side. The smells of saffron and cinnamon, roasted almonds and dates, sweet melons and oranges wafted through the air. Bright red hand-woven rugs hung from every other stall in the market. "Haji Amin!" called the young man again, this time louder. Haji Amin turned around and saw the young man running towards him. "Good sir," said the young man, catching his breath, "I heard that you are leaving Ashgabat tonight and travelling to London, where you will meet Abdu'l-Baha." "Yes, that is true," answered Haji Amin, eyeing the young man curiously. "It's my dream to go and meet Abdu'l-Baha," said the young man with a shy smile. "But I work in the fields and can barely afford the clothes on my back. I know it will always be just a dream." The young man reached into his torn pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in a thin cotton handkerchief. With both hands, he offered it to Haji Amin. "Please, can you give this to Abdu'l-Baha?" Haji Amin noticed that, although the young man's hands were stained from working in the fields, the handkerchief was spotless. "It's my meal for today," said the young man. Lowering his eyes, he whispered, "This is all that I have to offer." Haji Amin graciously accepted the gift with both hands and promised to deliver it to Abdu'l-Baha. That night, Haji Amin, together with a few friends, left Ashgabat. They travelled for many days and nights, on foot and horseback, by train and boat. Finally, after a long and tiring journey, they arrived in the crowded and smog-covered city of London. The next morning, the travellers received an invitation to join Abdu'l-Baha at a lunch that had been arranged in his honour. Although tired from their long journey, Haji Amin and his friends eagerly made their way to the house where the lunch was taking place. When they arrived at the home and saw Abdu'l-Baha, their hearts filled with joy and all feelings of exhaustion vanished. "Please come and join us for lunch," said the kind host as she welcomed everyone into the dining room. Abdu'l-Baha and the guests made their way into the dining room and took their seats at the table. Haji Amin, however, remained behind. He opened his bag and carefully took out the small package. He had not forgotten his promise to the young man in Ashgabat, and he was determined to deliver the gift to Abdu'l-Baha as soon as possible. Haji Amin entered the dining room and suddenly stopped. Never before had he seen such an extravagant feast. The large dining table was filled with all kinds of delicious-looking and colourful foods. Haji Amin then looked at the package in his hands. How humble is this gift that I am to give Abdu'l-Baha? That young man's lunch surely cannot compare to the feast on this table. Then, remembering the sacrifice of the young man, Haji Amin slowly made his way to Abdu'l-Baha. "Dear Abdu'l-Baha," Haji Amin whispered, but not softly enough as everyone hushed to a silence to listen. Haji Amin continued. "As I was leaving Ashgabat, a young man asked me to give this to you." He gave the small package to Abdu'l-Baha, adding, "The young man said that this was all that he had to offer." All eyes were now on the package. Abdu'l-Baha gently unwrapped the gift. To the surprise of all the guests, hidden in the handkerchief was a dried-up apple and 2 small and dry loaves of bread. Abdu'l-Baha's face became radiant. Without any hesitation, he broke off a small piece of the bread and ate it. He then joyfully and lovingly passed the bread around the table, saying, "Eat with me of this gift of humble love." The guests each took a small piece of the bread, and then ate of the great feast that was laid out before them. Yet Haji Amin could not help but notice that Abdu'l-Baha ate only of the apple and the bread. If only that young man could be here today, thought Haji Amin with a smile. The sacrifice he has made is truly a gift of love. The Veil. This story takes place in Akka in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The young boy carefully climbed up the stone seawall that wrapped around the old city of Akka. Steadying himself, he stood on the tips of his toes. He anxiously scanned the crowds of people walking through the narrow streets below. The sunlight danced on the red rooftops, and the blazing heat baked the cobbled streets below. Peering through the crowds, the young boy finally spotted his 2 visitors. He jumped down from the wall and ran towards them. "Thank you for coming," he said breathlessly as he reached Abdu'l-Baha and the doctor. "Please come this way. My uncle is in the building over there." The young boy guided them through a narrow alleyway and opened the wooden door of an old brick building. "He's on the top floor," he said. With a whisper, he added, "Thank you for coming." Abdu'l-Baha and the doctor entered through the creaking door and made their way up the narrow and dirty stairs. The doctor had never been to this building before, nor did he recognize the little boy. "Who is the patient that Abdu'l-Baha has asked me to come and visit?" he wondered. Reaching the top floor, Abdu'l-Baha and the doctor entered a small, dark room. Lying in the corner on a thin and torn mattress was the patient. The moment the doctor saw the patient, he stopped in his tracks. "This must be a mistake," he thought. "This can't be the man that Abdu'l-Baha has asked me to help. He has always been so unkind to Abdu'l-Baha." The doctor remembered how just last month, in front of a large group of people, this man had spoken rudely about Abdu'l-Baha, shouting, "Why do you speak to him? He is a Baha'i." This, even though Abdu'l-Baha had shown only love and kindness towards him. Abdu'l-Baha had even given the man's family food and clothes when they were in need. And now, although this man had shown only unkindness towards Abdu'l-Baha, Abdu'l-Baha again had come to help him, not only with food and money, but with a doctor too. The doctor reluctantly made his way to the sick man lying on the bed. He asked the man how he was feeling, and then asked to take his pulse. The man stretched out his arm. Then, to the shock of the doctor, with his other hand, the man lifted his grey cloak and held it in front of his own face. The doctor could not believe what was happening. Not only has this man shut out his heart to Abdu'l-Baha, but now he's covering his face so that he does not even look at Abdu'l-Baha, thought the doctor aghast. "I cannot bear to see such rudeness shown towards Abdu'l-Baha, especially after all that he has done for this man." Angry with the man, the doctor abruptly got up to leave. Turning towards the door, the doctor expected that Abdu'l-Baha too would leave. However, Abdu'l-Baha did not move. He remained by the man's side. The doctor paused. Abdu'l-Baha is showing only love, he realized. Following Abdu'l-Baha's example, the doctor turned around and slowly made his way back to the man, whose face remained covered by his cloak. The doctor examined him and gave him what was needed to get better. Only then did Abdu'l-Baha and the doctor leave. The doctor never forgot that day. Over the coming years, whenever the doctor would see the man, either in the street or in the market, his heart would fill with sadness. Despite Abdu'l-Baha's constant and untiring love, the man continued to shout rude and unkind words towards him. Whenever the man would see Abdu'l-Baha, even from across the street, he would cover his face with his cloak so as not to look at Abdu'l-Baha's face. How can a heart be so veiled? The doctor would ask himself sadly. Then, one evening, many years later, the veil was finally lifted. There was a chilly breeze in the air, and the winter sun was getting ready to set. The doctor had just seen his last patient for the day and was slowly making his way home. As he walked up the cobbled street, he noticed someone standing in front of the house of Abdu'l-Baha. He thought he recognized the man, but his eyesight had worsened over the years and he could not make out who it was, especially in the dark. Curious, the doctor moved closer and watched as the man knocked on the door. A minute later, the door opened and the street was flooded with light from the house. "I thought it was him," said the doctor to himself, this time seeing clearly that it was the patient who had covered his face so many years ago. What brings him to Abdu'l-Baha's home? Just at that moment, Abdu'l-Baha came to the door. To the doctor's surprise, the man fell to his knees and started to weep. "Forgive me, sir," he cried. "For 24 years I have done evil to you. For 24 years you have done good to me. Please forgive me." Abdu'l-Baha immediately bade the man to rise, showing him the same love and kindness that he had shown him for the last 24 years. The doctor's heart filled with the light of understanding. "Love," said the doctor to himself. "It can only be love that has caused the veil to finally be lifted." The Seat of Honor. This story takes place in Washington, D.C. in the year 1912. Today I am most happy. A breathless silence filled the hall at Howard University. The towering arches stretched over the captivated crowd of more than 1,000 people who had come to hear Abdu'l-Baha speak. Addressing them from the stage, Abdu'l-Baha continued, "I am very happy that white and black have gathered together in this meeting. I pray that you be with one another in utmost harmony and love." Rose sat on the edge of her seat and looked around in wonderment. Never before had she seen so many black and white people sitting together in one gathering. As a white American woman living in Washington, D.C., a city filled with racism and racial segregation, Rose had lived her entire life in a neighborhood where only white people lived, had gone to a school with only white children, and had mostly only white friends. "The world of humanity is like a garden," said Abdu'l-Baha, "and humankind are like the many-colored flowers." Rose thought deeply about these words. Abdu'l-Baha is saying that each person is like a flower in a garden. Every flower is unique, and the differences in color are what makes the garden beautiful. What he says is so true. How boring if all the colors were the same. Rose looked around the hall again. She felt as though she was beginning to see the world in a new way. If only everyone would think like this, she thought. Our city would be a much more just and fair place to live. As Abdu'l-Baha's talk came to an end, the audience erupted in applause and everyone rose to their feet. They spontaneously formed two lines, one on each side of the aisle, to make way for Abdu'l-Baha. As he left the hall, many bowed their heads in respect or waved their hats and handkerchiefs in gratitude. Rose followed the jubilant crowd out of the hall and started to make her way to the home of Madame and Mr. Khan. Madame Khan, Rose's friend, had invited her to Abdu'l-Baha's talk that morning. To Rose's delight, the Khans had also invited her to a private lunch at their home in honor of Abdu'l-Baha. After a short journey, Rose arrived at their grand 4-story home. "Welcome!" exclaimed Madame Khan joyfully as Rose entered the reception area of the house. "We are delighted you could join us." Rose looked around with wide eyes. Beautiful curtains of red and blue hung from the windows, and the walls were covered with golden threaded tapestries. "Allow me to introduce you to some of our guests," said Madame Khan. Miss Juliet Thompson, Mr. Alexander Graham Bell. Miss Thompson, the artist, Rose thought with excitement. And even Mr. Bell, the inventor of the telephone, is here. Rose could feel the anticipation growing in the room as they waited to meet Abdu'l-Baha. Once Madame Khan had finished making all the introductions, she turned to Rose and said, "Our honored guest Abdu'l-Baha is meeting with our friend Mr. Louis Gregory and will join us in a few minutes." Rose had never met Mr. Gregory, but she had seen his name in the newspapers a number of times. Mr. Gregory was a well-known African-American lawyer and promoter of justice and race unity. "I was so moved by Abdu'l-Baha's talk this morning," Rose said to one of the guests who was standing next to her. "His message of race unity is exactly what our city needs." At that very moment, the lively chatter in the room came to a sudden stop. Abdu'l-Baha had entered the reception area, with Mr. Gregory by his side. Rose's heart flooded with joy. "Dinner is served," announced Madame Khan. All the guests followed Abdu'l-Baha into the dining room. All the guests, that is, except for Mr. Gregory, who quietly remained behind. As they entered the dining room, Rose marveled at the long and elaborate banquet table. 19 place settings had been clearly marked, and Abdu'l-Baha, the guest of honor, was to be seated at the head of the table. Everyone took their seats. Suddenly, Abdu'l-Baha stood up and looked around him. "Where is Mr. Gregory?" he asked. "Bring Mr. Gregory." There was a sudden hush in the dining room. Rose looked at Abdu'l-Baha in astonishment. Surely Abdu'l-Baha knows that in America white and black people do not eat at the same dinner table, she thought to herself. Mr. Khan immediately rose from his chair and went to look for Mr. Gregory, who had already made his way out of the house. Rose watched curiously as Abdu'l-Baha began to rearrange the knives, forks, plates, and glasses to make one extra place setting at the table. A ripple of activity made its way down one side of the table as the guests each moved over to make more space. Just as the 20th chair was brought to the table, Mr. Khan returned to the dining room with Mr. Gregory. Abdu'l-Baha called to Mr. Gregory and invited him to sit next to him at his right-hand side. "He has given Mr. Gregory the seat of honor," thought Rose in awe. Abdu'l-Baha then turned to the guests and told them how very pleased he was that Mr. Gregory had joined them. Then Abdu'l-Baha began to speak about the need for justice, and that we are members of one human family, whatever the color of our skin. Rose watched and listened in wonder. By inviting Mr. Gregory to the table, she thought to herself, Abdu'l-Baha has shown us what we need to do to bring about unity and justice. Talking about race unity is not enough. I, too, need to put my beliefs into action. The Roses. This story takes place in New York City in the year 1912.
Read all about it, read all about it.
The distant shouts of the newspaper seller carried up into the apartment above, where Howard Colby Ives sat. Howard fidgeted his feet impatiently. He adjusted his tie and looked up at the clock on the wall. 20 minutes past 3. Howard let out a long sigh. It's been 20 minutes since the interview started, thought Howard warily. When is the interviewer going to give Abdu'l-Baha a chance to speak? Howard, together with a few other guests, had come to an interview that was taking place with Abdu'l-Baha. The interviewer, a gentleman with round glasses, was writing an article about Abdu'l-Baha and had asked to meet with him. But since the start of the interview, only the interviewer had spoken. His questions were long, one after the other, without pause, and he didn't give Abdu'l-Baha any opportunity to answer. Restless, Howard looked around the room. The man to his right kept tapping his pen on his knee. The woman to his left kept opening and closing her fan. Howard looked up at the clock again. 26 minutes past 3. The interviewer was still talking. Howard's eyes strayed towards the door. He noticed the enormous bunch of pink roses that had been given to Abdu'l-Baha as a gift that morning. The bunch of roses was so large and the stems so long, no vase big enough had been found to put them in. What did they put the roses in? Howard wondered. He leaned sideways and chuckled softly at what he saw. Someone had placed the roses in the umbrella stand. How creative, he thought. The voice of the interviewer pulled his attention back into the room. The interviewer was still talking. Someone must stop the interview, Howard thought impatiently. He looked around the room to see who might put an end to this uncomfortable situation. Suddenly, he had a thought. Perhaps Abdu'l-Baha will just end the interview himself. Howard looked to Abdu'l-Baha. To Howard's surprise, however, Abdu'l-Baha sat perfectly relaxed. His brilliant blue eyes shone brightly, and his face was radiant. He did not seem impatient or upset. In fact, he seemed to be listening with great interest to every word that the interviewer had to say. Abdu'l-Baha's expression seemed to show infinite love, patience, and understanding. Finally, the interviewer paused. Howard held his breath as silence filled the room. Then, ever so gently, the silence was broken by the soft voice of Abdu'l-Baha. The humility and majesty in Abdu'l-Baha's every word and expression captivated Howard's heart. Howard looked at the interviewer and was surprised by what he saw. Something within the gentleman had changed. He was now listening eagerly to Abdu'l-Baha, and his face was luminous. His whole being seemed to show humility. Could it be that all this time Abdu'l-Baha had been listening patiently, letting the interviewer empty his heart and mind? The same way that it is impossible to pour water into a cup that is already full, perhaps Abdu'l-Baha was waiting for the interviewer to empty himself of all his questions and ideas so that he could receive Abdu'l-Baha's words and love. How different the conversation might have been had anyone interrupted the interviewer before he was ready to listen. Abdu'l-Baha finished the interview and arose from his chair. All those gathered stood to their feet. Abdu'l-Baha warmly embraced the interviewer and walked with him towards the front door. Suddenly, Abdu'l-Baha paused. Seeing the enormous bunch of roses in the umbrella stand, he let out a joyful laugh, filling the room with laughter and delight. He then gathered the magnificent bunch of roses in his arms and placed them in the arms of the interviewer. Surprised, the interviewer beamed with happiness. He looked so radiant, so humble, and so transformed. Howard's face broke into a wide smile. He knew that he would never forget this experience. He had learned from Abdu'l-Baha what it means to truly listen. The Night. This story takes place in Haifa in the year 1920. Amu Esfandiar, come and look, shouted the little boy. Curious, Esfandiar walked to the window where the little boy was peering out onto the street below. Isn't it amazing? Said the wide-eyed little boy. It looks like it's for a king. Esfandiar looked out of the window. Parked below was the most elegant car he had ever seen. Esfandiar and the little boy watched as the driver, dressed in a dark suit and tie, stepped out of the car. With a spotless handkerchief, he started to wipe all traces of dust from the car. Amu Esfandiar, the little boy turned to Esfandiar. What's that fancy car doing here? That car has come to take Abdu'l-Baha to a very special ceremony, Esfandiar explained. Abdu'l-Baha is going to be knighted today. Wow! He's going to become a knight, exclaimed the little boy. But why? On behalf of the King of England, the British governor is thanking Abdu'l-Baha for all that he did for the people of Haifa and Akka during the war, said Esfandiar. The little boy looked confused. Let me explain, said Esfandiar patiently. Before the war started, Abdu'l-Baha asked the Baha'is near the Sea of Galilee to grow plenty of wheat and corn. But rather than sell the grain they harvested, Abdu'l-Baha asked them to store it instead. But why would they store all the grain? Why not just sell it at the market? Asked the little boy. That's what the Baha'is thought too, said Esfandiar. They couldn't understand why all this grain should be stored. But then the war started. Haifa and Akka were cut off from most of the world, and people were worried that there wouldn't be enough food for everyone. Oh, so Abdu'l-Baha gave them the grain, exclaimed the little boy. That's right, smiled Esfandiar. Because of Abdu'l-Baha's wisdom and generosity, thousands of families, whatever their religion or nationality, had enough to eat. And that is why the king wants to honor Abdu'l-Baha with a knighthood. The little boy's eyes sparkled as he imagined Abdu'l-Baha being knighted. But then his smile disappeared. But Amu Esfandiar, he said with a whisper, why aren't you taking Abdu'l-Baha to the ceremony? You always drive him everywhere with your carriage. Esfandiar let out a gentle sigh. Today's occasion demands something grander, more luxurious and comfortable. The little boy could see that Esfandiar was feeling a little sad. He wondered if Esfandiar wished that he could drive Abdu'l-Baha to the ceremony. Then, as though Esfandiar knew what the boy was thinking, he turned to him, smiling. "As you know," he said, "worldly honors and fancy ceremonies mean little to Abdu'l-Baha. He has accepted the knighthood as someone would accept a gift. Even still, surely for this occasion, a beautiful and comfortable car is more fitting than a slow and humble carriage." The little boy was quiet as he thought about Esfandiar's words. He then gave his Amu a wave and ran down the stairs to play. As he reached downstairs, he heard a commotion of activity. "Where is Abdu'l-Baha?" the members of the household were asking worriedly. "The car is waiting for him and he's nowhere to be seen." "I wonder where he is," thought the little boy as he headed towards the orange tree at the back of the garden. He spotted the biggest, brightest fruit and carefully climbed up the trunk to the highest branch. "Delicious," he thought as he picked the juicy orange. Suddenly, he heard footsteps under the tree. It was Abdu'l-Baha. He was walking towards Esfandiar, who had come to the stables to tend to the horses. The little boy saw Esfandiar's eyes light up with joy. "Abdu'l-Baha wants Esfandiar to take him to the ceremony," realized the little boy, his face beaming. "He doesn't want to travel in that fancy car. Abdu'l-Baha has never wished for comfort for himself, nor has he ever wanted to come across as being better or more important than anyone else." Without a word, Esfandiar prepared the carriage. Within a few minutes, he was driving Abdu'l-Baha to the governor's house. The little boy stuffed the orange in his pocket, his heart beating with excitement. He clambered down the tree and ran out onto the street. Taking a shortcut through the old city, he ran through the small alleyways and winding streets, until at last he arrived at the house of the British governor. Pausing to catch his breath, the little boy looked up at the high wall surrounding the house. He spotted an old olive tree with branches that drooped over into the governor's garden. His love for oranges had made him a good climber, and so he quickly climbed up to the very top of the tree. Peering down into the garden below, the little boy saw a large crowd of guests. There were Muslim, Christian, and Jewish leaders and important people from all over the city. A large tent had been pitched in the garden, and British soldiers stood in line waiting for the arrival of Abdu'l-Baha's car. A military musical band stood ready at the gate to announce Abdu'l-Baha's entrance. But where was Abdu'l-Baha? The little boy watched as Abdu'l-Baha, quietly yet majestically, walked in through the side entrance of the garden, on time and without any pomp, and with Esfandiar by his side. What a surprise to the guests, who had been expecting him to arrive through the main entrance and in the fancy car. The band began to play in celebration, and the ceremony began. From the top of the tree, the little boy looked across at Abdu'l-Baha and smiled widely. Abdu'l-Baha was truly the most humble knight there ever was. The Gift. This story takes place in Dublin, USA, in 1912. Madeline took all her dresses out of the cupboard and piled them on top of the bed. She then emptied the drawers, taking out her hats and scarves and shoes. Finally, she placed 2 large suitcases at the foot of the bed. Madeline looked at the tower of clothes and sighed. "Oh, Maddie," she thought to herself, "how on earth are you ever going to fit all these clothes into just 2 suitcases?" Only 2 weeks ago, Maddie had packed these same suitcases and left her home to come to New Hampshire for a holiday. Maddie lived in a large and beautiful house, and although she owned so many things and had everything she needed, she felt as though something was missing in her life, and her heart was sad. She had thought that maybe a holiday would cheer her spirits. Now, after having spent 2 weeks away, Maddie prepared to return home. But even though her suitcases were overflowing with brand new things, her heart still felt sad and empty. "You should never have done so much shopping on this trip," she scolded herself. "Now you'll have to go out and buy an extra suitcase." Suddenly, she heard talking outside the guest house she was staying in. Curious, she made her way to the window and looked outside. Close to the entrance of the guest house, she saw 2 figures standing together. "That's Abdu'l-Baha," exclaimed Maddie eagerly, "and that must be his secretary." Just yesterday, Maddie had seen Abdu'l-Baha for the first time. Returning to the guest house from her afternoon walk, she had noticed a group of guests crowded in the reception area. Scanning the crowd, Maddie's eyes had immediately fallen upon a majestic figure standing among them. He was wearing a long tan-colored robe with a snow-white turban on his silvery flowing hair. Maddie's heart had filled with awe. She had felt as though she were standing in the presence of a king. But it wasn't his clothes that made her feel this. Rather, it was his loving presence and the radiance of his blue-grey eyes that had spoken to her heart, reflecting compassion, wisdom, and strength. For a moment, Maddie's heart had felt full. As the guests were making their way into the dining room, Maddie had turned to one of the guests and whispered, "Who is that man?" "That is Abdu'l-Baha," the guest had replied. "The newspapers say he is an apostle of peace. He was made a prisoner for 40 years for teaching justice and unity. Now that he is free, he's traveled all the way to America to help us understand how to live together in peace." Now, as Maddie stood by the window looking out at Abdu'l-Baha, she wished that he could help her find peace in her own heart. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sight of an old man slowly making his way up the quiet street. His jacket looked dirty, and his trousers were torn and full of holes. How cold he must feel in his ragged clothing, Maddie thought. All of a sudden, Abdu'l-Baha's secretary called out to the man. The old man stopped and then walked towards Abdu'l-Baha. What could Abdu'l-Baha want from that man? Thought Maddie. Her eyes then widened in disbelief. Not only did Abdu'l-Baha smile and greet the man as though he were a dear friend, but he took the old man's hand into his own. Maddie watched Abdu'l-Baha say a few words, let go of the man's hand, and then step behind the guest house. Where has Abdu'l-Baha gone? Thought Maddie, perplexed. She tried to peer through the corner of the window, but she couldn't see anything. She opened her window, but all she could see was the secretary and the old man, both of whom looked as if They were waiting. Maddie, too, waited. A few minutes later, Abdu'l-Baha reappeared. Maddie noticed that he had wrapped his long coat around himself and was holding something in his hand. What is he carrying? She wondered. Maddie watched as Abdu'l-Baha lovingly handed a small bundle to the man. The old man held out the item in front of him, and his face broke into a wide smile. Maddie let out a small gasp. Abdu'l-Baha had given his own trousers to the man. Maddie watched, her eyes shining with tears, as she saw the joy on the old man's face. She noticed that Abdu'l-Baha too looked happy. One would think that he was the one who had just received a gift. Maddie couldn't help but feel happiness in her own heart. "May God go with you," she heard Abdu'l-Baha say to the man. The man thanked Abdu'l-Baha and happily continued on his way. Maddie looked at the enormous pile of clothes on her bed and thought of the great emptiness and unrest that she had been feeling. Turning her gaze back to Abdu'l-Baha, she thought of how Abdu'l-Baha had sacrificed his own comfort to help someone else. Maddie realized that a life of giving to others was what would fill her own heart with joy and peace. The Visitor. This story takes place in Akka and Haifa in the late 1800s and then in the year 1921. Sitting in the corner of the courtyard, shaded from the heat of the midday sun, 8-year-old Samira giggled with delight as she watched the orangey-brown kitten chase its shadow playfully around the courtyard. The kitchen door swung open, and the kitten went scurrying up the wall and over to the neighbor's house. Samira's mother came out of the kitchen into the courtyard, holding a tray of food. "Samira," called her mother, "please open the door to the bedrooms." "Yes, Mama," said Samira. She jumped up and opened the door. Samira watched as her mother warily made her way to the bedroom at the very back. Her mother's hands were shaking as she placed the tray at the foot of the door. Taking a deep breath, Samira's mother knocked, pushed the door open, and placed the tray on the floor inside the room. Samira could hear coughing from inside. Samira's mother said a few words, then, just as quickly as she had opened the door, she pulled the door closed and made her way back to the courtyard. Just 2 days ago, Samira's younger brother, Salim, had gotten into trouble for playing outside that bedroom door. Mama had scolded Salim, telling him that it was not safe and that he needed to stay away from that door. "But why?" Salim had asked her. "Because I don't want you to get sick," Mama had replied sternly. Then, more gently, she had added, "like your uncle, who is very sick." Samira and Salim loved their uncle very much. For the past few weeks, he had been unwell and now spent all of his days resting in bed. One by one, the neighbors had stopped visiting. Samira and Salim felt as if an invisible wall of fear had been built around their home, keeping everyone away. Back in the courtyard, Samira watched as her mother made her way into the kitchen. Her brow was furrowed into a frown, and she looked worried. With the kitchen door left open, Samira could see her grandmother sitting at the kitchen table shelling peas. "How is he?" she asked anxiously as Samira's mother walked in. "Not well," said Samira's mother, shaking her head. "He is so weak and constantly coughing, and he hasn't bathed in days. But I dare not go close to him, otherwise I'll catch it too, and then we'll all get sick." Samira's grandmother's eyes filled with tears. "We can't just leave him like this." "I know," said Samira's mother, her voice trembling. "But there is nothing we can do." Samira felt her stomach tighten into a heavy knot. She had never seen her grandmother cry. Samira, too, wanted to cry. That night, Samira went to bed with a heavy heart and a prayer for her uncle on her lips. The next morning, as the first rays of the sun peeked through the cracked and dusty window, Samira awoke to the sound of talking in the courtyard. "Thank you," she heard her mother say. "We are so grateful." "Who is Mama talking to?" thought Samira curiously. "No one dares to come here anymore." Rubbing sleep from her eyes, Samira peered through the small window, but only in time to see her mother close the courtyard door to the street. The visitor had left. "Mama!" called Samira as she opened the little window. "Who was that?" Samira's mother looked at Samira and smiled. It was the first time in weeks that Samira had seen her mother smile. "That was Abdu'l-Baha," she said. "He came to help care for your uncle." Samira had seen Abdu'l-Baha many times, but she had never met him before. Samira and Salim would often walk up the cobbled street to where Abdu'l-Baha lived, just to catch a glimpse of him. And when they would see him, he was almost always surrounded by a crowd of people. Sometimes there would be up to 100 women, men, and children who would come to seek his love, his gentle words of comfort, and his wisdom. He never turned anyone away. And now, when no one else dared to help care for her uncle, it was Abdu'l-Baha who had come. Samira's heart felt lighter. There was a joyful skip in her step as she ran out to play with the kitten. Abdu'l-Baha returned the next morning and every day after that for many days, selflessly caring for Samira's uncle. Sometimes he would come with fruits and sweets. Other times he would bring books to read to Samira's uncle. Each time, Samira would watch in awe as Abdu'l-Baha would put aside any fear for his own health and would lovingly take care of her uncle. The day that Samira's uncle took his last breath, Abdu'l-Baha was there, sitting by his side. Many years later, when Samira was a young woman, she heard of the sudden and unexpected passing of Abdu'l-Baha. Heartbroken, Samira, together with Salim, went to his funeral. That day, there was not a cloud in the sky. More than 10,000 women, men, and children of every religion and background, rich and poor, had come to show their love for Abdu'l-Baha. As she looked at the grieving faces around her, Samira felt overwhelmed, seeing how many hearts Abdu'l-Baha had touched. She knew that the heart of each person gathered there, like her own heart, had been illumined by the light of Abdu'l-Baha's love and selflessness. The end. Mighty is available on firstvalley.books.com.